Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Ear Whisky. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm joined today with the one, the only Charles Maclean. But before I introduce him, I just want to give you a huge shout out to my amazing patron supporters. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel, enabling me to continue to do this, bring on people who are amazing. And I'm so humbled by the support that you guys provide me with. Thank you so much. All right. Today's guest is a living legend. Let me introduce you to Charles Maclean. Hello, my man. We made this happen. How are you?
Yeah. With difficulty. I'm computer illiterate, and so it's taken a bit of time.
No worries, man. No worries. I'm just super excited that you wanted to do this.
It's very kind of you.
No, without it sounding any kind of brown nosing in any way possible, you're one of the living whiskey personalities, legends that everybody listens to, and you have had such a huge journey through just the world of whiskey ever since you started out, and been a part of so many interesting things, internationally and also just within Scotch whiskey. Could you just take us through a bit of how you even began this whole thing with whiskey in the first place?
Well, now, I could go back to the 1970s, and I was, like many of us, hadn't a clue what I was going to do. So my first degree was in art history,
Right.
In the University of St Andrews. And then I went to Dundee University and did a law degree, which I completed in Edinburgh University. I qualified as a solicitor in the late 70s. But even while I was doing my apprenticeship, I knew that the law was not for me. So while I was in 1977, I set up my plate as a literary agent. I was always very interested in books and writing and what have you, publishing.
Right.
And an agent that, of course, acts on behalf of authors in relation to their publishers and so on.
Yeah.
I abandoned the law the following year, 78, 79, 78, I would guess. And went to the literary agency full time, promptly starved, used my art historical qualifications to manage part time a couple of galleries in Edinburgh. But then started to ghostwrite. Publishers would phone me and say, "Have you any authors on your books who could help so and so write a book about such and such?"
Right.
But this time I had a business partner, and we started to ghostwrite. But the breakthrough really came when a first cousin of mine, who was in advertising in London, came to work in Edinburgh as an account manager, account director. And the agency, a highly creative agency that he worked for, did not have an in-house copywriter, unusually.
Oh.
So in effect, my partner and I became the copywriters for this agency. So we've got literary agency, ghostwriting books, and advertising copywriting. And it was through copywriting that I came to write about whiskey. I wrote my first job for a whiskey company. It was Bell's, as a matter of fact, in 1981. And during the 80s, and then added to the ghostwriting, I was writing books, but after 85, I was writing books under my own name. Subjects were sort of Scottish non-fiction, if you like.
Right.
Castles, tartans, kilts, whatever, all that sort of stuff. Fishing villages on the east coast of Scotland, that was the first one.
Yeah.
But, so agency, books on the back burner, and then the living was made by advertising copywriting, as I mentioned. During the 80s, I, by chance, did a lot of work for many whiskey companies. And by 1988, I had a sufficient track record and sufficient interest to make a fist of a proposal to a publisher in London for a book about Scotch whiskey. And that was published, that was commissioned in 88 and published in, I think, 92. And from that, what I might laughingly refer to as my career took a swerve towards whiskey.
Right.
And I'm currently working on my 18th book about.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
About Scott. How many ways are there to skin a cat? You know.
18 books, man. Wow. I haven't written one. I'd love to write. I love writing myself. But 18 books, that's quite an accomplishment. But not only have you written 18 books, you've also been, working on others, making, what is that called? Forewords or whatever for other
Yeah, yeah.
people's books. Um, you worked on a book about Danish whiskey, didn't you?
I did actually, fun
With
enough. Yeah,
the Brownstein back
yeah,
in the day.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
the
you've been all over the.
the author of that it was proposed to do a big book about Scandinavian whiskies, and
Right.
but alas, that came to nothing. But yes, Bernstein was the behind the first one. Mm.
Right. Yeah. Wow. So, whoopsie. So I think what a lot of people would like to know is what makes a good whiskey in your opinion?
I think it's now that's a big question.
I know.
Um, at the end of the day, it's bound to be a personal choice.
Mm,
Although, if you present a number of whiskies to a panel, even a panel of amateurs, by and large, they will come down in favor of certain styles. The
right.
most obvious division, perhaps, is I think strongly flavored whiskies, and by that I mean heavily peated whiskies or heavily sherried whiskies. These usually shine at and indeed in blind tastings and competitions. And indeed, when you're
Right.
judging a competition, you have to be very aware of not favoring a particular style. You've got to judge whiskies against similar styles, really, to be fair.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
what makes a good one? Obviously, some would say that when you're doing an evaluation of whiskey, professionally, the nose it leads. Our noses are much more sensitive than our palates.
Yes.
Um, so you smell the whiskey, obviously, and then you taste it. There should be, many would say that there should be a correlation between the smell and what the smell promises, the aroma, and the delivery on the palate. If there's a disjunction,
Right.
if you draw a parallel with wine, you can find wines that are very, very rich, but then they're thin in the mouth,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is unsettling. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that it should deliver what's promised on the nose should be delivered on the tongue. I think also that what you're looking for is a balance. So if there are many detectable aromas, that gives depth and complexity on the nose. And then in the mouth, you're looking for what we call a balance of primary tastes. So there should
Right.
be a nice balance. Well, you're looking at mouth feel as well, the texture, which can be acerbic, it can be mouth filling, it can be creamy, etc.
Yeah.
You would think of that, but then you look at the balance of primary tastes, and then you look at the finish, the length of the finish. Now, short
Right.
finish isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's a long finish is really de rigueur for certain styles of whiskey. If the whiskey is rich in character, you would hope for a long finish, and if it
Right.
doesn't deliver a long finish, you're slightly disappointed. So there's
Yes.
a mix of things that you can understand, and
Yeah.
but I do think the perhaps the most important thing is to evaluate whiskey within its category, within its age, and within its style.
Yeah. To its
It's
peer,
really
so to
not
speak.
fair to think of them all and just based entirely on age, for example. I mean, you can find
Right.
magnificent young whiskies,
Yes.
and you can find some old whiskies which are frankly disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, that's rather a lengthy and complicated
No,
answer.
no, no. I love lengthy and complicated answers. That's the best kind. But I would agree. Yeah, it is. So what you're saying is that to distinct what is a good whiskey? You need to judge it, up against its peers, in terms of age, maybe
Precisely.
price point, quality, cask, influence, and etc.
It all comes to bear. Yeah. Although,
Right.
in fact, much of my work now is to do with sensory evaluation. Advising
Right.
people who bought casks, advising a lot of whiskey companies. Um, for example, for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, we meet fairly regularly, and anyway, for some of these independent bottlers, I will advise whether the whiskey is, in my view, good enough to be bottled now, whether it should be left in that same cask for 2 years, 5 years, whether it should be re-racked into a more active cask,
Right.
or whether, quite frankly, it should be got rid of, traded.
So I was thinking about, you have your have been in depth in not only Scotch whiskey but whiskey in general, like we talked about earlier. You've also been, in some way interacting with Danish whiskeys, and also I know Tasmanian whiskeys, and so on and so on. Are there out there outside Scotland, the holy mecca of whiskey? Are there contenders down the line to the whiskey throne of Scotland?
Um, the 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 Scotch whisky industry is somewhat arrogant in that regard, because they say that they're so far. I mean, well, things are changing, of course,
Right.
with all these new distilleries emerging all over the world. But it was always said that there's more Scotch sold per annum than all the other, not what we call non-Scotch, American, the leading ones, American, Canadian, Japanese, and Irish.
Right.
There's more Scotch sold than all of them put together. Now, I don't know what the up-to-date stats are on that. So, but the Scotch whisky industry is somewhat cocky about that.
Right.
I think that it doesn't really matter, because there's no best whiskey.
Right.
And again, going back to what I was saying, if you're looking at American whiskey is made in a certain way to achieve a certain flavor profile. And if you're looking at American whiskey, you should compare it with American whiskeys, not with
Yes.
Scotch. They don't want to make Scotch. They're not.
No.
They're not trying to make Scotch. And the same is true with Irish and with Canadian. So compare like with like. Now, I mean, I have a very high regard. I mean, I've met distillers all over the world, and have a very high regard for their skill and their concern with quality, their concern to develop flavors that they want. And so I never go, for example, I never go public on scores. I may score privately. I might, if I'm doing a panel, I would ask them to score. But I think it's iniquitous to publish scores. I mean, I know that consumers, it makes it easier for consumers, but and publishers love scores and things like that.
Yes.
Because of the effort that goes into creating the desired flavor. It's who am I to I might be in a bad mood, but anyway, it's all aside of the point. But the essential thing is to compare like with like, to compare within categories.
Right.
And so there's no best whiskey, and prizes for best whiskeys are nonsense, really. I mean, in my view.
Yeah. I get that, and it's an important point that you make, that even though that whiskey is booming everywhere, all over the world, it was a very nice point you made there. Like, American whiskeys are not, the majority at least, is not trying to be Scotch or Irish.
No.
They're trying to be whatever they are, and being a whiskey nation, somewhat here in Denmark as well, we are basically trying to make Scotch. But the thing that I would love for Danish whiskeys to do is to sort of find a foothold on what is Danish whiskey. What is, that I always tend to say that a good Danish whiskey would be someone that was rye based, because we have a long-standing tradition with rye and so on and so on, and our foods and stuff like that maybe could reflect something. So I would agree that it's not, you're not looking at it through like a ranking of number one and then the rest. It's more like, flavor wise and preference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, the great thing is with all these new distilleries and I mean, I think that are they not trying to develop really a more peculiar, a really Swedish style of whiskey? And then Fien, the wonderful experiments that are being done there.
Yeah, McMurray, they were using Swedish oak, weren't they?
I think they were, and
Yeah.
they were kilning over. I can't remember now what, but over wood. Was it birch wood or something like that? I'm not sure.
They have been doing juniper, I think.
Oh, juniper! Really, that's interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, that reminds me. Farrellochen, a Danish distillery here, they add a percentage of smoked dried malt that is used with smoking nettles instead of peat.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because that harkens back to a long-standing old tradition of how you would smoke cheeses. So all intertwined in history in that way. So yeah, people are trying different things, and it's a great time to be alive in terms of whiskey.
Oh, it's fantastic, isn't it? It really is. There's such a wonderful choice of styles and brands and so on to choose from. It really is. It's
yeah, and also
golden age.
Yeah, and also in that regard, I think the majority of whiskey producers out there, and also the ones who are coming out of the ground, in recent years, are looking at tradition and history with a lot of respect, but also looking into the future, saying, right, but how can we make this unique? And trying to push the envelope, experimenting and doing weird stuff that maybe turn out wrong or unpleasant, but at least now we know. And that sort of, pushing a frontier kind of thing is really exciting to me, at least. I don't know how you take that.
Yeah, no, I agree. The Scotch distillers are somewhat constrained, whiskey makers are somewhat constrained because of the extraordinary tightness of the definition of Scotch whiskey.
Yes.
Now, the tight definition is there to maintain the high reputation of Scotch. But some some distillers feel constrained by that. I mean, if you think, for example, since you can add nothing to Scotch spirit, look at the success of these American whiskies where they've added honey, or they've added, or Canadian whiskies that have added, what do they call it? The sweeteners and stuff. Canada's got a very loose definition, but
they do.
And so some would say that some Scotch distillers would say that they're constrained, but I think that working within the definition, for example, a number of the recent distilleries in Scotland are going back and looking at old-fashioned barley varieties. I mean, Golden Promise, for example.
Yes.
And exploring that. They're looking at yeasts as well. You see, I mean, in America, yeast is very important. In Japan, yeast is very, very important. There's strains of yeast that the individual distilleries use.
Yeah.
In Scotland now, well, over the last 20-odd years, gradually the Scotch distillers have gone really it used to be a mix of brewer's yeast and distiller's yeast. But now a very few use brewer's yeast. It's more, they don't get such a consistent product. And the obsession of the Scotch whisky, and this is another point which is quite interesting, the traditional concern, the major concern of the Scotch whisky industry is consistency, from batch to batch to batch, and they go to huge lengths to make sure that the spirit is consistent. But a lot of these new upcoming distilleries, these recently founded ones in Scotland, are exploring yeasts. They're not looking for consistency. They're looking for flavor, and so they might produce different styles of spirit. And make a virtue of the difference between one and the next. So there is a lot of experimentation that can be done within the definition of Scotch. But the key thing is the passion that the people are making the whiskey, whether they're traditional, if you like, employed by long-standing companies, or whether they're newly founded businesses. Yeah.
Right. How does, looking at Scotch whiskey, like you said, it is a fairly restrained, restricted kind of category of whiskey, and it just as a simple way of putting it, it seems to me at least that the only sort of wiggle room there really is, other than like yeast and these minor thing, is the used oak, the casks that you can use, because that, what is it, like 60 to 80% sort of consensus that is the majority of where the flavor comes from. But even though with
you've got to be a little bit careful about that, because I know that some I won't name any names, but some makers proudly claim that 85% of the flavor comes from the wood, and then they demonstrate to what length they go to secure the best possible oak wood. This in itself is not necessarily a good thing. In that, again, going back to your original question, a balance between what they call the distillery character and the mature character is desirable. So when you're tasting very old whiskies, it's really they may be absolutely gorgeous to taste, but it's very difficult to tell where they've come from, which distillery they've come from. They kind of grow together, and so I think the ideal is to retain some of the distillery character. If you're tasting even a 30-year-old Talisker, you want to know that it's come from Talisker Distillery and not from somewhere else.
Wherever,
So the making a virtue of the influence of wood. The wood, I mean, it's interesting, Matt. The first major book about applying Victorian science to whiskey distilling was published originally in 1898, and then there was a revised edition in 1913 by a man called Nettleton, J.A. Nettleton, and it's a 600-page book.
Wow.
He devotes a paragraph to less than one page to maturation, to wood.
Wow.
And it was you just fill a cask and then you refill it until you think it's stuffed,
Right.
And they would mark cask, yes, refill, or no, break it up.
Right.
And it's really only recently, indeed, you might argue that it's since the renaissance of interest in malt whiskies that wood has become so important, because if the whiskey is made to go into blending, they can balance up the flavors to achieve what they want to achieve. So, I mean, obviously the cask has to be still relatively active. It has to be capable of maturing its spirit, its contents. But now, of course, we think an awful lot about the influence of the wood. I mean, it is crucial, but it probably, I would put it on average at about 50% of the flavor comes from the wood. I mean, but
really?
It depends. It depends. It depends so much. Obviously, if you fill into a brand new car, or they're always second hand, as it were, but they're seasoned is the correct word, not second hand. But if you're filling into an active, what we call first fill, although in fact it's second fill because it's been seasoned either with sherry or with bourbon,
right?
And occasionally with wine and stuff. If it's a very active cask, it'll have a much greater impact on the spirit than a refill cask. And obviously you can usually refill a couple of times. Maybe you can get 3 fills, maybe 4. But so by the time, it's having less impact. The wood's having less impact,
right? Which
is great if you want a long maturation.
Yes.
If you want to bottle younger, then you want to go for a more active cask. And then you've got the difference between Spanish oak and American oak, both of which deliver, as you know, different colors and different flavors at the end of the day.
Right.
So there's numerous. It may be of interest to some of your viewers that the oak was only defined. It was always the most desirable material for casks, but it was only made by law in 1990. Until then, it was just wood. It had to be filled into a wooden cask. This is for Scotch, and the America's different.
What?
It's always
1990.
Yeah. That when they specified oak, and so it is possible. I mean, it is possible that there are some casks made from beech or poplar, I'm told, lurking in deep in warehouses. But I mean, the longer I have references from the 1860s for the benefit not only of oak casks but of sherried style transport casks that have been seasoned with sherry as early as the 1860s. And
so theoretically, you would be able to stumble across in a giant warehouse somewhere an old beech cask or chestnut cask or something like that.
Yeah.
But how would that then be able to be sold as Scotch whiskey since that 1990 law?
No.
But
you wouldn't unless if you did a closed wood analysis. You could identify it, I suppose. But they would want to. They would look at it as if it was an oak cask and assess the flavor profile, quality of the whiskey, and bottle it up without saying, or put it into a blend. They're not going to waste the whiskey, are they?
No, absolutely not. No, that's sort of mind blowing to me because 1990 is so recent. I was born in 92. So it's basically as long as I've been alive, but Scotch whiskey has been around for so long.
Yeah.
But it's only so fairly recent that there's been a written down thing about, well, it needs to be oak.
It has to be oak, yeah.
Wow.
And
it doesn't require used oak, right? It's just oak.
Just oak, yeah.
Just oak.
Yeah.
Why not use more new oak? Is that because the barrels are more expensive?
Well, again, it's traditional. You see, in order to make straight bourbon or straight rye, as you know, you've got to fill into virgin casks.
Yes.
The Scotch whisky industry, probably based on parsimony in days gone by, used a lot of casks actually were raised by the 1880s, 1890s, when Scotch really began to take off. The casks used tended to be transport casks, and sherry transport casks were favored. But if you look at the statistics, there weren't enough casks coming in to supply the demand by the 1880s. And so a number of cooperages set up, particularly Lowry in Glasgow, and they seasoned casks. So they raised the casks from scratch, but then seasoned them typically with sherry. So it's really traditional. If the Scotch distillers wanted to make, I mean, you do find the very occasional. They're usually used as finishing casks, brand new oak casks.
Yes, the virgin oaks.
Virgin oak, yeah. And it's but there's very little in the Scotch system. But because if you Diageo, for example, when their casks are coming in from America, their first fill, they tend to fill them with grain whiskey before filling them with malt for maybe 3 or 4 years, 5 years, to take out some of the activity. And when you taste these old grain whiskies, they're not unlike bourbon, actually, because the flavor of bourbon, straight rye, is very much dominated by flavors coming from the wood, oaky, vanilla tastes. Now they don't want that, you see, in Scotch whiskey.
No, the mellowing vanilla.
They in effect they don't want the flavor to be dominated by flavors coming from the wood.
Right.
So that's why I think that they always season the casks. But again, it's probably born of old Scots parsimony in days gone by. They were cheaper, than.
Yes, obviously, if you can get your hands on these casks just lying around, no one can use, and America can't use them for bourbon again. So they
they can use them for the casks again, but it just becomes American whiskey.
Yes, absolutely. They can use it for different things, but just not bourbon. Of course, you have access to cheap barrels. Why not use that? I would do the same thing.
I'll tell you an interesting thing, which you may not know. The American barrels, which they account for, I would guess, about 85-90% of the casks coming into the system. And then many of them, of course, are made into remade hogsheads. So they come in as approximately 200 litre barrels, and then they're broken down and increased in size to 250 litres into a hogshead. But the American oak was always favoured particularly for transport, sherry transport casks. Nowadays, when we think of sherry-style whiskies, we're often thinking of European oak, Spanish oak.
Yes.
But the transport casks until the 1960s were made from American oak, and indeed the big butts in a sherry solera are also made from American oak. So American oak was familiar, but ex-bourbon casks were not until 1946. 1946, that was when the American barrels started to come into the Scotch system and be adopted by the Scotch whisky industry. Quite interesting
would that mean that prior to like the 40s you mentioned there, that the majority of Scotch whiskies was sherry influenced?
Yes, I can say that. But they were
some way
mostly refill casks.
Right.
Obviously, the first time the cask is filled, so what we call a festival cask, there would be influence from the sherry in the walls of the cask.
Wow.
But actually, much more so, because in those days there was a substance called paxoret used as a colorant to tint the whiskey for consistency, particularly in blends. And paxoret is a very, very intense. It's like a very intense. It's what they call a vino de couleur. They boil down Oloroso sherry and they add some PX and Pedro Jimenez, very sweet sherry. And they boil it down until it's a thick substance and very, very sweet. And a little bit will color the whiskey. And so for consistent purposes, consistency, batch to batch, they used paxoret.
But that would also color the flavor, so to speak.
Indeed. And that's why that was banned in I think at the same time, 1990, as an additive. And so such discernible, it's that you don't often find actual sherry flavors, but you do find sort of related dried fruits, prunes, fruits, this sort of thing in some of these older whiskies. Whether it comes from the sherry, not certain, because they favor Oloroso sherry, and that's dark, but it's quite dry, And so I think it tends to come from paxoret. And now, of course, paxoret has been banned, and so they use spirit caramel, which is described as being organoleptically inert. It has no smell or taste, which is actually bullshit, because if you add it to water, but it's very difficult to discern in whiskey, by the way. I mean, I've done experiments with this, and even in quite large amounts, 3 or 4 drips into a glass, and making it very dark. And if you're nosing blind, you can pick it up in the taste, and it's actually a bitter taste, not a sweet taste.
I've tasted the coloring on its own. And it has that sort of bitterness to it, like a slightly burned quality.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I'm refined enough to pick it out in a whiskey. I wouldn't claim that, but I would be able to maybe pick it out in water. I haven't tried that.
Yeah, exactly the same with me. I got it right every time in water, but I mean, I did an experiment with some of the malt maniacs some years ago, and there were 6 of us, and we were sent samples, about 6 or 8 samples, ranging from Rosebank to Beaumont in terms of flavor. And then we were asked to have 3 glasses, one with no, it was all done blindfolded, one with no spirit caramel, one with 2 drops, and one with 4 drops or 5 drops. And then you had an assistant to hand them to you, and you had to guess whether it was A, B, or C. And we all admitted that, I mean, it was much more difficult than you'd think. On average, and we're talking about people like Serge Valentin, who is, I mean, real experts, and the Olivier Humbrecht and so on. and we all admitted that, we were all scoring over 60% right, but never with total confidence.
No, 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 no. Of course not. But what is your opinion about the whole transparency about coloring? Should there be some kind of law that states that if you are indeed adding color to your whiskey, you need to state it on the bottle?
They do that in Germany.
They do, because practically all the whiskeys we get here in Denmark is through the German retailers. So that would say, at least the Giacio ones and the bigger brands. So I can look at a bottle of Lagavulin or Talisker and turn it around and say, oh, it says mid-fop stuff, and with coloring. But that doesn't apply to
otherwise. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I sympathize with the need, because the average consumer, if he's buying one bottle and it's this color, and then the next one is that color, and then there's a common confusion that the older, the darker, the older,
the better. Yeah.
So for consistency purposes, I can sympathize. And you have to remember also that the by and large the amounts are minuscule. There have been exceptions in Scotch whisky, but the amounts of caramel are very, very small.
Yes.
But notwithstanding that, from your and my point of view, and I'm sure that the viewers in this program as well, because you can learn quite a lot from the color. Let me demonstrate it as well.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this, you can see, is, well, you can't see it's too.
Oh, that's very light.
Very light.
Yeah.
So that tells me that this is a refill American oak.
Right.
It's probably quite a young whiskey.
Right.
Actually, it's not. It's quite an old whiskey, but it's refill American, slightly green lights. But why did I start on this?
Coloring.
Yeah, and so clearly that has not been tinted.
Right.
But it's so you can make a judgment like refill American oak by looking at the color.
Right.
And if you add caramel, you can't.
No, so it at least becomes very, very guessworky.
And so from a connoisseur's perspective, it's useful to know, and indeed increasingly for high-end bottlings of malt whiskey in particular, the companies are moving away. It's natural strength, natural color, this sort of thing.
Yes, it is starting to appear that way. More and more. And I think the way I look at it is that I'm not ineptly, crusading against coloring, because I don't think that there should be law interfering with private businesses. That's one thing.
Quite right.
But on the other hand, I think it could be a nice touch to have something saying that you need to put on there if it's colored or not, because the people who care will actually appreciate it, even though it is colored, and they may not prefer it to be colored. And the people who don't know and don't care and are just average consumers, buyers for presents or whatever, don't know where to look for it, and it's not a part of their analyzing that bottle. So I think it's a win-win if it was put on the bottle.
Well, I would prefer to put it on the bottle, I must say, but but like you, I wouldn't want it necessarily to be incorporated into law that you had to, or to ban tinting at all. I mean, I think that would be destructive.
Yes. I absolutely agree. So sort of looking at your whiskey life, so to speak, how is the whiskey culture, both in the industry but also from a consumer oriented point, changed over the years that you at least have been involved in whiskey?
Well, the simple answer to that is the renaissance of single malt whiskies
from the 80s.
Yeah, through the 80s. I mean, obviously the small beginnings were in the early 60s with particularly Glenfiddich,
right.
And a number of independent, i.e. non-DCL, non-distillers company, now Diageo, Saying, "Hey, wait a second." They were looking at the success of Glenfiddich, and they thought, "Wait a minute, now we're missing a trick here." I mean, when William Grant's decided to promote Glenfiddich as a single malt, actually they called it a pure malt or a straight malt, I think, in the States, and the rest of the industry thought this is absolutely crazy, because the fortunes of the Scotch whisky industry since the 1880s, 1890s were entirely based on blends.
Right.
And all the whiskey made went into blends. And it was only because there was it was to do with amalgamations, and the market, the customers for malt whiskey were blenders. Very, very little malt whiskey. I mean, in 1980, it was 1 in 100 bottles were bottled as single malt.
Wow.
I mean, very, very small amount, 1%, and so it was tiny.
Yes.
But the blended Scotch was where it was at, you know, and so Grant's breaking the mold was shocking, but then the success was equally shocking. So, you know, if you look at the minute books of companies, they looked on with surprise, and then they began to think, well, wait a minute now, we're missing something here. I mean, Macallan, for example, started to lay aside stock in the 1960s. They had a filling program where they bottled a number of casks. You know, it varied from year to year, but I mean, you know, 20 butts. You know,
right.
But they saw the success, and it was commented on in the board meetings. I've seen some of the meetings of the board minutes, and they resolved to take Macallan to market as a single malt, because it was even it was very highly regarded as a blending whiskey. You see,
right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but they appointed their first marketing director, a guy called Hugh Metcalf, who died last year actually, and or was it the year before? Anyway, he was appointed in 1978. Macallan's entire promotional budget for its own whiskey in 1978 was £50. £50.
Oh,
it was a
wow.
donation to the Scout Hut in Craigellachie or whatever, you know.
Right.
And then they went to market in 1981, the same year that Glenmorangie went to market and started to promote these two single malts. And I mean, it's staggering that it was so recently, you know.
Yeah.
And so it was beginning the so-called Renaissance was beginning to gather momentum during the 80s. And then I think a very significant thing was the introduction, the launch of the classic malts by United Distillers, when Guinness bought the Distillers Company, and then their distilling was called United Distillers, and of course now Diageo.
Right.
The whole company is now Diageo. And they very wisely saw they saw their huge inventory of.
Go on, I'm listening.
Yeah. And and they said, well, we're missing a trick here, you know. And so they released in 88, 89 the first so-called classic malts, the 6 original classic malts.
Yes.
And that really opened up. It was very clever because it also displayed the differences. They were called regional differences, but the differences between lowland, highland, Speyside, island in Talisker, and Islay, and they were all very different. And the people thought, wow, you know, this is malt whiskies. They're not all the same, you know.
No, it's not all smoky and aggressive.
No.
Yeah.
The average punter blended Scotch they're pretty similar. People who are brand loyal, they know when they're getting what they want, you know. But by and large, the differences are very, very subtle, and that's all part of the secrets of blending. That you're trying to create something where all the flavors are tightly integrated.
Absolutely.
So that was and then through the 90s, you've got this rise in interest in malt whiskey, Scotch malt, but indeed globally malt whiskey, and it carries on, and now malt whiskey is a very considerable proportion. I mean, until quite recently, I'm trying to think what the. I mean, until quite recently, you could still say that the 90% of the malt whiskey made went into blends, but
the number's dropping, right?
It's dropping. The more is being bottled as the malt. Mm.
Charles, I have to ask, what are you drinking right now? What was that you showed before?
Well, this one I got here is a Talisker 1978.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Talisker is one of my favorite whiskeys.
I love it.
Oh, amazing.
And it's
1978.
Yeah, Simca, which I have to assess. But,
yeah, hard work, I guess. No, I just because you were sitting there drinking a whiskey, I pulled out my current favorite whiskey, more commercial ones, the Lagavulin 8.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, that is, to me, we talked about balance before. We talked about spirit character, distillery character, not being overwhelmed by the cask and so on. This whiskey has proved to me that what I like in terms of peated whiskeys. I like a bold peated spirit, Lagavulin, etc., in a fairly subtle, or you could say tired, bourbon cask.
Yep.
To have that, and the 8 years is just a perfect age, to my palate at least, for that cask to be a balancing element of vanillas and a bit of candy notes and creaminess, but then have that punch of that distillery character just blasting through it all, but fairly really well integrated into each other. I just love this whiskey. I can drink it all day.
Lagavulin 16 is one of my favorite whiskeys in the world. I adore.
Yes, me too.
And and when that 8-year-old was released, I initially wasn't terribly convinced.
Right.
I thought it was somewhat harsh. But it's exactly what you're saying. If you like the full-on Smoky Isla punch by Young, and the 8-year-old delivers that in full measure. I mean, likes of Lafroig 10, Talisker 10. You see, I think is absolutely brilliant. You get the full impact of.
Yes. That is also a very balanced whiskey. That is also catered to a huge market. You can buy Talisker 10 anywhere.
Yeah. But then they've the trouble is they've introduced all sorts of brand extensions for Talisker, which apart from age statements, Porterie and 47 North and various other ones. Which I think are rather. I don't know why they do this. It's sort of confusing. But for me, Talisker 10 is the benchmark. Although I have to say,
will that 78 one be a contender then?
I've written my notes on this, so I'm not. But it's not as open on the nose as it's perhaps a bit cold. Gorgeous. It's more like, now this is unusual for Talisker because it's got a waxiness.
Oh, that's interesting.
Rather like Clownish or Brora.
Is that an age thing you would guess, or is it an production method thing?
It's an interesting thing, Matt, but I think it may be to do with barley variety. Oh. Because in 78 they were probably using Golden Promise. Maybe that's a bit late. Maybe you probably have. Well, I don't know, but certainly whiskies made even if they're bottled quite young. Actually, I mean, there have been in the 60s such malt whiskies as were released as singles, were often bottled at 8 years old, and but you get this waxy candle wax characteristic, which is so attractive.
Yes, that is a very pleasant note. Yeah.
And now you most obviously find it in Clynelish. The other one, which is a gorgeous whiskey, by the way, is Aberfeldy 21. And that
I haven't tried that.
Aberfeldy generally has a very slight waxiness, but the 21-year-old, which is a very reasonably priced actually,
right,
has it in full measure. But do you know the story about well, I'll tell you the story about where the waxiness comes from in Clynelish, and which was told to me by one of the chemists who discovered. Diageo requires that all the samples from all their 28 distilleries are sent to a lab in Elgin for blind analysis, and their nosing panel, which comprises, I think, maybe about 7 or 10 people on the panel, but at least 5 have to look at the samples. And they go into a wee room, and the glasses are all obviously nosing glasses like this, white spirit with a barcode. And they read the barcode into the computer, they nose, and they come up with one descriptor. There happen to be 14 descriptors, and they're very simple words like green grassy, meaty, smoky,
right,
etc. And then there's one that's waxy, and that is Clynelish. And so it's in the spirit, in the new make spirit, this characteristic.
So it's a distillery character.
Yeah,
it's not something achieved through maturation or.
No. Wow. But why should who knows? Anyway, some years ago, it lost the sample was identified not as waxy, but as green grassy or something like that.
Oh,
and so if in any week, if the spirit is not on character, the manager gets a telephone call. You weren't on character. What the hell's going on? And his job's on the line. The key job of distillery managers is to retain spirit character, and B, yield, to keep the yield up, the amount of alcohol per ton, per ton of barley. And so his job's on the line. And this continued for 3-4 weeks until finally the senior chemist who told me this went up to Brora to find out what the hell was going on. And they went through all the books and everything, and they could find nothing. There was no change in barley variety. There was no change in distilling regime. There was nothing. And then Douglas said to the manager, he said, "Look, did anything happen just that before you lost character?" And he looked in his diary and he said, "Oh, well, we had somebody around who we were replacing a receiver tank, and we took the opportunity to clean the pipes. And they discovered that there's some horrible waxy gunk that builds up in the pipe and in the receivers. And that's what gives the character."
No way.
Yeah. And and of course now they know when they have their annual kind of clean up, make amend and so on, the silent season, they carefully take out the gunk and put it into buckets and then put it back before starting distilling again. Amazing.
Wow.
And that actually lends a clue, I think, to why some of the whiskies from the 60s, 70s have this waxy characteristic, even in blends, actually, funnily enough.
Right. Because they were just not aware of that moving part again.
No, the distilleries were not as tightly cleaned and maintained. I think that they were dirty old places. And I think that this whatever it is, I would love to know why should it build up at Clynelish, or could you introduce it to another distillery? If I had
that would be interesting.
I would want that,
Yes, me too. Put that in some kind of, for me at least, some kind of peated whiskey or something like that. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So basically, a drain pipe, in a way, is the reason for that waxy. So it's basically very, very nasty.
Yeah, it would be. the pipe connecting the receiver
Yes.
to the spirit safe, and then it goes through the spirit safe and then into the receiver, and then it goes into the, what do they call it, the intermediate spirit receiver, and then it's put into cask, and so it's in the pipe work and maybe in the receiver itself, in
It's passing through that gunk. Gives that wow. That's I love that. I love that sort of we can be as humans so focused on control and controlling the narrative of every single step of the process, and then you realize that wow, this thing we had no idea even existed is in the basic DNA of our business.
But that is the wonderful thing about this subject that we love, that there are still what they call lacunae. There are still gaps in the knowledge. Jim Beveridge, Dr. Jim Beveridge, who's a good friend of mine, and he's the so-called master blender for Johnny Walker. I mean, he's such a modest fellow that he wouldn't claim it himself, but he says that he heads up the team. You know what I mean?
Oh, yes.
And when he started at Distillers Company in, a long time ago, and and these bright young chemists, they believed they would crack the secrets of where flavor comes from in 2 or 3 years. But then he realized, and he's humble enough to admit, and I think any of them would actually, that you open one door and then there are 3 or 4 others, and so there are still lacunae. There are still aspects which defy science.
Yes,
you cannot. That's why, in one distillery you can't imitate the make of a neighboring distillery. Even you can probably get quite close to it nowadays, but you can't directly imitate. And you've got so many. Even if you got your spirit consistent, well, it'd be difficult to precisely imitate the spirit from the next door distillery. But then you've got all the variations on wood, and in the fact that each cask matures its contents in a slightly different way. So you're getting different flavors being built up in from one cask to the next.
Yeah, it is quite magical.
It is. That's one of the things that keeps me to the game, because if it was all entirely scientific, frankly, it'd be boring for me.
Yeah, there would be no mystery. There would be no, something in the shadows we can't quite map out, but we are all attracted to. I think that is why a lot of people who are into whiskey gravitates towards whiskey specifically, because it is such a diverse spirit category. But also it's like, we know a lot of stuff, and up until a certain point beyond that, it's all guess. It's angels and myths and unicorns and fairy tales, legends, and
and that going back to your earlier question, that's where Scotch has the edge in terms of the angels, myths, and unicorns. Although I have to say that the history of Scotch whiskey is much better documented than talk about myths and things. Irish and American whiskey, wow, the very difficult to disentangle myth from, the whiskey, it's like a Victorian parvenu. They invent their pedigree, and it goes on in Scotch as well as in non-Scotch. But they're shifting the history, but nevertheless, the mythology and the unicorns, as you say, I love it. Are part of the enjoyment, quite frankly.
Yes, it is. It is, and that's why you can, like you mentioned before, and an image just popped into my mind. It's like, it's not just a cornflakes factory where you push a button and stuff goes in, and there's process, and then stuff gets pushed out on the other end and packaged and shipped off. It's like, if you just, I remember a story I heard about someone being a master distiller. I don't remember where this is from, but a master distiller going off a vacation break, like 1 week for an entire year, and then there was a guy replacing him, and he went to the bathroom for like 2 minutes, managing the stills, and that disrupted the entire batch being distilled. I don't remember what this distillery was, but how these small moving parts are so easily, influenced. And also, I think a lot of the unsung heroes of the whiskey industry, we talk about the malt masters and the master blenders, but but the people running, on the ground floor, the one who turns the handles, and through years of the knowledge being passed down through generations, know that, well, you switch this handle at that. Obviously a lot of things get more and more, digital and automized, being automated. Um, but how little it takes to alter something completely, and how much effort it in the same aspect requires to stay in your lane. I think it's
Well, I think you've raised two things there. The human intervention element has been much reduced. I mean, the use of computers in larger units are there to assist, to make it easier, not to replace. But
right.
if the still man can look on the screen and see if a pump jams, for example, or
Right.
it's not as if they all. In some places, of course, it all happens automatically, and the guy just keeps an eye, make sure that it's working properly.
Right.
But and I think that one of the reasons why whiskies made, again, until relatively recently, are, dare I say it, more interesting, is because of the human intervention, that
Yes.
they are variable. And, if the guy went to sleep, or if he whatever, something went wrong or whatever it is, and you do get variations in spirit character. But to go back to what we were talking about right at the start, a very good friend of mine, Dr. Nicholas Morgan, who some of your viewers will know, he said, and I always remember him saying vehemently at some tasting, he said, he had a full bottle in his hand. He said, you have to, when you buy a bottle of whiskey, you're buying a hell of a lot more than liquor in a bottle. You're buying craft, you're buying history, you're buying great skill and tradition,
Yeah.
And then somebody else concluded, you're also buying the blood of one small nation, which I love. Isn't that great?
Yeah, that's amazing.
But there's an awful lot more than to Scotch in particular, but to any whiskey than just liquor in a bottle.
Yes, it's not just it is more than that, and that's also the thing that shows through these small distilleries popping up everywhere in these small craft distilleries.
Absolutely.
It is carried on the backs of will and the knowledge to not be satisfied with what we have, but to push the envelope and to not belittle history in any way, but to move forward. And I talked to had a local, or not local, but a Danish craft distillery who's just coming out of the ground as we speak, and they just filled like their 25th cask, and they were just, he was pumped and he was so excited, and they haven't even narrowed down their distillery character yet. Where does that distillery go from within the next 10-20 years? But you're right, it is carried on the shoulders of people who have a passion. It's like art in a lot of ways, and music and what have you. It is just the human element driving it, and that also sort of raised a question. But how much does a master blender or malt master actually affect a distillery profile? Because on one hand, he has sort of a cabinet to stick to, and you have to create these flavor profiles, my friend. But at the same time, he's also an artist. He's also a creator.
Right? Well, I think it's particularly true. I don't think that except perhaps in the smaller and newer distilleries, once they've got so on the production side, once they've got the spirit as they want it to be, the key thing, as I mentioned, is to keep it consistent. Right. Some of the new ones might explore with different. I mean, I was given a bottle of the first Scotch rye whiskey, Scotch single rye, from our
Wow.
Beacon distillery yesterday. It's just been released, and the so they can explore and experiment and so on. But from a blender's point of view, they're the real artists, because they've got to work well, not only creating new blends, but maintaining the consistency of existing blends, the bread and butter stuff. And they've got to work with, and it's not rather like cooking in the sense that it's not as simple as having a recipe, you know,
Right.
because of the cask influence, but also because some of the ingredients might not be available, you know, at the right age and from the right cask. And so they've got to, using the inventory that they've got, they have to produce a consistent blend time and time and time again, you know, in huge volumes in some cases.
Yes.
Yeah, huge volume. And
that is also, I guess, why you see changes over decades, you know, in not dramatic changes necessarily, but just slightly changes, like you just mentioned that, well, we don't have the stock to do this, so we have to sort of cut the edges just ever so slightly.
There's a phenomenon called flavor drift. So they go to great lengths, unless they consciously want to change the character of a blend.
Right.
There is a phenomenon called flavor drift, where with the best will in the world, it kind of changes, and you know, indiscernibly really to start with. But then if you look at the same whiskey from, say, 20 years ago as today, same whiskey. I'm thinking of blends.
Right.
It's different, and the blender with his nose has to try and make sure that doesn't happen. You know, that's part of the job.
It's quite a position to have.
I'm going to have to fly because I have this gentleman.
I know, and we have gone more than an hour.
Oh,
Charles, we have.
Enjoy. Let's do it again.
Oh, really? I would love to. I reached midway through my questions, and then we just drifted into talking. I love this. Let's do it again. I absolutely would love that.
I'd be delighted to do that. So draw a line, and then I'll raise my glass to you as well. Hold on.
Just. Cheers, Charles.
God bless you. Sounds of all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks very much for watching.
Yeah, thank you for watching, and thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.